Although trapped between the two narratives, the angel is by no means neutral. His position is a political and prophetic one that takes the side of one over the other. The first narrative is the master narrative, or the hegemonic discourse that is literally created, constructed, and told by the masters, or the victors of history. This narrative of progress is teleological, and I would even argue theological in nature. It stresses unity, sameness, binary oppositions, which at the same time are hierarchical. It is a narrative of domination, conquest, and imperialism disguised as progress, equality, sameness, unity, colorblindness, democracy, freedom, etc. This narrative is characterized by what Adorno calls identity thinking, whereby all phenomena is identified by its place in some system of universal concepts. However, Adorno, Benjamin, Marcuse, and some of the postmodernists have made us aware that there is something else going on. This unifying teleological narrative of progress piggybacks on another narrative that contradicts the first, but yet is a product of the first. You see, the narrative that presents itself as universal is really particular and partial. Progress is progress for the few. Liberation is liberation for the few. Freedom is freedom for the few. The few take themselves to be the whole. Hence, those who do not belong to the elite few are marginalized, alienated, and sidelined by the inevitable flow of history as it seems to side with the elite few. The exploited majority are not the agents of history, but rather the victims or the ruins of history. To some extent, it seems that they're excluded from history altogether. The question that has haunted us since Marx is, can the ruins of history become the agents of history, and how? Or, in the words of Beatrice Spivak, can the subaltern speak? This question leads us to our third point in subject position, the angel of history. The angel is troubled by the above question. Can we awaken the dead? Can we make whole what has been smashed? As the angel of history surveys history, the second narrative, which has been silenced by the first, emerges. From this position, the pains of the subaltern become audible. The second narrative, the narrative of the rulers, crying out against the rising voices, that's the narrative. First, we see unity. We see difference, not equality for slavery, not liberation, but methods of oppression. We see cracks, fissures, a dismantling, a time out of joint. From this perspective, that which has been constructed, masters begin to self-destroy, deconstruct from within. The angel occupies two positions via his position between the first and second narrative. He is the postmodern and the prophetic. He attempts to construct a third narrative, narrative of liberation. This is no synthesis of the first narratives. It is an attempt to overcome one by the other. The master narrative must be overthrown by the narrative of the ruins. This liberation is not identical to the liberation spoken of by the masters, who speak of liberation and freedom all the time. This liberation is something entirely new. Now, for the remainder of this paper, I would like to explore two political possibilities which are presented to the angel of history. First, from the standpoint of the postmodern, the storm called progress is the same storm that perpetuates the need for postmodern theory. That is, the storm called progress is the ongoing proliferation of the master narrative that propels the angel backwards into the future. This storm does not mean to go back and awaken dead. As a result, the ruins continue to grow skyward. The cracks expand, fissures multiply, the more construction, the more deconstruction, etc. This is the truth of postmodernism. The persistent refusal of the master narrative to recognize its own nakedness secures its position. Part 2, postmodern theory, from political promise to political paralysis. The political promise of postmodernism lies in its dismantling of oppressive master narratives. The postmodern critique of Western philosophy, literature, ideals, concepts, politics, hegemonic discourses, etc., has revealed to us that the emperor has no clothes. Herein lies the promise of hope or liberation in postmodernism. The deconstruction of master narratives promises the emergence of a new era, one that is no longer dominated by oppressive worldviews and hegemonic discourses. However, as the postmodernists were disclosing the names of the emperor, they began to take off their own clothes. We found ourselves bearing witness to an intellectual striptease, a theoretical orgy of sorts. Critical thinking and critical political action was reduced to the bird and the master, instead of theorizing a form of political action that would abolish the master-slave relationship altogether. Now, let me say at the outset that what we're calling postmodernism here is a very general term that is used to cover a multiplicity of theories, theorists, and tendencies. It would be quite unfair to paint all postmodernists with the same brush. In fact, many theorists whom we label postmodernists will reject the title altogether. Therefore, my critique here is not intended to be a critique of all postmodernism or all postmodernists in their works. So, for example, a careful analysis of Foucault will have to distinguish between the early Foucault and his rejection of subjectivity and the later Foucault from 1979 to his death in 1984, where he returns to the subject in an attempt to develop a theory of resistance. One would not only have to distinguish between the various texts and moments in Derrida's career, but also between Derrida, a product of the Western philosophical tradition, and some of his not-so-careful followers. One would have to examine the Kantianism of the late Foucault and the Ripper as well, and the modernist tendencies in Deleuze and Guattari. We will have to examine the Marxist residue in Jameson, Leclau, and Moore. So here I simply want to critique a certain tendency that the above thinkers, some of them share in common, and that they share in common with their followers. So there are three problems that arise in postmodernism that is of concern here. The first is the status of the subject, or subjectivity. The second is the status of theory itself. That is, must grand or totalizing theories always be oppressive? And the third problem is the status of dialectics. In the interest of time, I will keep my comments about the first two problems very brief, because it is the third one that I want to focus on for the remainder of the paper. So postmodernists such as Foucault are right to challenge the traditional view of the autonomous subject. They are right to recognize the ways in which subjectivity is often a product of the ways in which various social forces intersect. To put it simply, the subject is a result of various ways that society writes on the body. For example, masculine identity or subjectivity has little to do with one's sex. Masculinity is produced via an interpretation by society of what human penises should be like. Hence, the child born with a penis is labeled and forced to engage in certain social practices that are interpreted as masculine. However, all we have here is an account of how certain types of subjectivities are formed. We can still go as to say that all subjectivity is shaped by social context, but we must be careful not to replace one totalizing discourse with another that can be equally oppressive. One theorist who is sympathetic to postmodernism and critical of this particular tendency is Bell Hooks. And here's a quote from Bell Hooks. She writes in her essay, Postmodern Blackness, considering that it is as subject that one comes to voice, then the postmodernist focus on the critique of identity appears at first glance to threaten and close down the possibility that this discourse and practice will allow those who have suffered the effects of colonization and domination to gain or regain a hearing. Even if this sense of threat and the fear it evokes are based on a misunderstanding of the postmodernist political project, they nevertheless shape responses. It never surprises me when black folks respond to the critique of essentialism especially when it denies the validity